January 1944. Snow lies heavy over the forests of Eastern Europe. Boots sink into frozen mud. Rifles are cold to the touch. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thunders closer than it should be. German soldiers wait, not for orders, but for clarity that never comes. Across their Reich cities flicker beneath Allied bombers. Rail yards burn. Factories work through the night, then go silent by morning. Trains arrive late or not at all. Fuel is rationed, 2 drops. Ammunition is counted by the bullet. On paper, Germany still feels millions. On maps, front lines still stretch from the Baltic to the Atlantic. But something unseen has begun to unravel. Units are replenished with boys and old men. Commanders receive orders that ignore terrain, weather, and reality. Victories are promised. Retreat is forbidden. The war has not ended, yet the certainty that once carried the German army forward is gone. What remains is endurance, without direction movement, without momentum. And to understand why the German army began to fall apart in 1944, we must first step back into the pressures, decisions, and miscalculations that brought it to this frozen moment. By the end of 1943, the German war effort had entered a phase it could no longer reverse, only delay. The language of victory still echoed in official statements, but the reality at the fronts told a different story. Germany was no longer shaping the war. It was reacting to it. The turning point had not come in a single dramatic collapse. It arrived through accumulation. Loss after loss, decision after decision, each one narrowing Germany's remaining options. On the Eastern Front, the summer battles of 1943 had consumed the last strategic reserves built during earlier years of conquest. Armor formations that once spearheaded deep penetrations were reduced to defensive tools, used to plug gaps rather than break lines. Replacements arrived without adequate training. Tanks arrived without fuel. Divisions existed in name long after their effective strength had vanished. The Red Army, by contrast, had learned. Its officers adapted tactics. Its logistics expanded. Its factories, far from the front, produced weapons in numbers Germany could no longer match. What had once been a war of maneuver became a war of attrition, and attrition favored the side with deeper reserves of men, machines, and time. Meanwhile, in the West, a different pressure mounted. Allied air power did not aim for quick collapse. It aimed for exhaustion. Night after night, bombing raids struck industrial centers, transportation hubs, and fuel facilities. The damage was not always visible immediately. What mattered was disruption. Rail schedules slipped. Spare parts failed to arrive. Skilled workers were killed, displaced, or reassigned to emergency repairs. Germany's industrial output, often cited as impressive on paper, hid a dangerous truth. Production depended on an increasingly fragile system. Factories could build tanks but not enough engines. Aircraft were assembled but pilots were in short supply. Ammunition stockpiles existed but trains could not reliably deliver them to the front. Fuel was the most critical weakness. Synthetic fuel plants became priority targets, and their loss rippled across every branch of the armed forces. Training flights were cancelled. Armored units were immobilized. Commanders planned operations, knowing they might not have the fuel to exploit success or escape failure. Manpower shortages compounded every problem. By 1944, Germany had already mobilized deeply into its population. Casualties from years of fighting could not be replaced with experienced soldiers. New units were formed from teenagers, older reservists, and men pulled from essential industries. The result was an army growing numerically thinner even as the fronts expanded. The command system strained under these conditions. Orders from above demanded static defense, where flexibility was needed. Retreat was treated as weakness, even when withdrawal was the only rational choice. Officers faced impossible choices. Obey orders that risked annihilation, or adapt and face punishment. Morale suffered quietly. German soldiers were not yet defeated, but many sensed the shift. They noticed the absence of air cover. They felt the delay in supplies. They watched Allied forces return after setbacks stronger than before. The psychological advantage that once belonged to Germany had slipped away. By early 1944, the war had become something new for the German army. No longer a campaign of calculated risk and rapid decision, it was now a constant effort to hold ground, hold cohesion, hold belief. And as the pressure continued to mount from every direction, the foundations beneath the army began to crack, setting the stage for the decisions and rigidity that would accelerate its collapse. As material strength declined, Germany's greatest vulnerability became its leadership structure. By early 1944, the German army was not only fighting stronger enemies, it was constrained by a command system, increasingly detached from battlefield reality. At the center stood Adolf Hitler's personal control of military operations. Earlier in the war, his interventions had occasionally aligned with success. By 1944, they had become a liability. Decisions once delegated to experienced field commanders were now dictated from headquarters, often based on ideology rather than conditions on the ground. Maps replaced reconnaissance. Determination replaced flexibility. Orders emphasized holding ground at all costs. Retreat was framed as betrayal. Entire formations were instructed to stand fast even when flanks collapsed and supply lines vanished. The result was predictable. Units were encircled not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked permission to move. German generals understood the danger. Many argued for elastic defense, trading space for time, preserving forces for counterattack. But dissent carried consequences. Commanders who withdrew without authorization were dismissed, sidelined, or worse. The army learned to obey first and survive second. This rigidity coincided with Germany's most dangerous strategic reality, fighting a multi-front war without the resources to sustain it. In the east, the Red Army prepared massive offensives along hundreds of kilometers of front. In the west, the Allies assembled men, ships, and aircraft on a scale impossible to conceal. In Italy, German forces remained tied down. In the air, the Reich faced relentless pressure. There were not enough divisions to defend every sector effectively. Instead of concentration, Germany attempted coverage. Instead of strength, it relied on presence. This diluted combat power everywhere. Logistics worsened the situation. Commanders received reinforcements that existed only on paper. Divisions were ordered to counterattack without fuel. Defensive lines were drawn across terrain that could not be held with available manpower. The gap between planning and execution widened until it became unbridgeable. Inside the ranks, this disconnect was felt immediately. Soldiers received contradictory orders. Supplies arrived sporadically. Promised support failed to materialize. Confidence in leadership eroded not suddenly, but steadily. The German army had not lost its ability to fight. What it lost was coherence. Strategy no longer matched reality. Orders no longer reflected conditions. The system that once allowed rapid adaptation had hardened into immobility. By the spring of 1944, Germany stood on the edge of a decisive year. Its enemies prepared coordinated blows. Its leadership refused to bend, and its army spread thin, exhausted, and constrained would soon be tested beyond its capacity to endure. That test would come not from one direction, but from money revealed through the human, tactical, and moral dimensions of a force beginning to fracture. Angle 1. The ordinary German soldier. By 1944, the experience of the average German soldier had changed fundamentally. Earlier campaigns had been defined by movement, rapid advances, clear objectives, and a sense of momentum. Now, the war was static, uncertain, and relentlessly defensive. Soldiers spent weeks in improvised positions, short on food, ammunition, and winter clothing. Mail from home arrived sporadically, often carrying news of bombed cities and displaced families. Replacements no longer came from seasoned training units. They arrived young, underprepared, and unfamiliar with the men they were sent to reinforce. Cohesion suffered. Veterans carried the burden of combat knowledge while knowing their numbers were thinning beyond recovery. The psychological toll was heavy. Fear was no longer tied to a single battle, but to the certainty that the next attack would command that reserves would not. Air superiority had vanished. Allied aircraft dominated daylight hours, turning roads into death traps and movement into risk. Soldiers learned to hide rather than maneuver. Survival replaced initiative. Faith in eventual victory faded, replaced by a quieter hope to endure long enough to see the war end. This erosion of morale did not manifest as collapse but as fatigue so deep it dulled aggression and initiative. The army still fought, but it no longer believed. Angle 2. Leadership paralysis at the front. At the tactical level, German officers faced a shrinking margin for decision. Orders from higher command grew more rigid just as battlefield conditions demanded adaptability. Requests to shorten lines or withdraw to defensible terrain were routinely denied. Counterattacks were ordered without sufficient forces or logistical support, often resulting in unnecessary losses. Commanders understood that every failed stand cost irreplaceable men. Yet deviation from orders risked removal or arrest. This created a culture of hesitation, not cowardice, but calculation. Officers delayed decisions, hoping conditions might change, knowing that any choice carried danger. Communication breakdowns compounded the problem. Bombed infrastructure disrupted signals. Reports arrived late or incomplete. Higher command responded with directives based on outdated information. The result was fragmentation units fighting isolated battles without a coherent operational picture. The German army of 1944 still possessed discipline and experience. What it lacked was freedom of action, and without that freedom, even the most capable force begins to stiffen. 10. Fracture. These human and command failures were only part of the story. Beyond the men and their leaders lay deeper structural imbalances of machines, fuel, and numbers that would further accelerate the unraveling. Angle 3. Technology without By 1944, Germany still fielded advanced weapons-heavy tanks, powerful anti-tank guns, and late-war aircraft designs that impressed on paper. But technology without sustainment is illusion. Fuel shortages, immobilized armored units, spare parts were scarce. Maintenance crews worked miracles with nothing to work with. A tank that could not move was not an asset, was a liability, drawing fire and morale downward. Allied forces, by contrast, emphasized reliability and supply. Their equipment was simpler, easier to repair, and supported by vast logistical networks. German crews often abandoned functional weapons because fuel or ammunition ran out first. Superiority in design could not compensate for inferiority in endurance. Angle 4. Allied numerical and logistical dominance. The imbalance of numbers became decisive in 1944. The Allies could absorb losses and return stronger. Germany could not. In the West, Allied divisions landed with overwhelming naval and air support, sustained by uninterrupted supply lines. In the East, Soviet formations attacked in waves, coordinated across vast fronts. German units faced the reality of fighting enemies who could replace losses overnight. Every failed defense widened gaps that could not be sealed. What had once been a qualitative edge was drowned by quantitative force applied, methodically, relentlessly. Perhaps the most decisive angle was invisible. Soldiers noticed when promises failed, when reinforcements never arrived, when air cover did not appear. The belief that discipline alone could overcome material reality eroded under constant pressure. Surrender, once unthinkable, became a calculation for survival, especially in the West. In the East, fear drove resistance longer, but even their exhaustion prevailed. The army did not collapse in panic. It thinned, withdrew, and endured until it could not. By mid-1944, these angles converged. Human fatigue, command paralysis, technological strain, overwhelming enemy power. Together, they created a moment where pressure turned into rupture. That rupture would arrive in a series of blows, swift, coordinated, and decisive, marking the true turning point of the German army's war. By the spring of 1944, the German army stood in a posture of waiting for an attack it knew was coming, but could not precisely locate, waiting with reserves that existed in theory more than reality, waiting under orders that allowed no margin for failure. Along the western coast of Europe, fortifications stretched from Norway to the Bay of Biscay. Concrete bunkers, minefields, and gun emplacements formed what was known as the Atlantic Wall. On maps, it appeared formidable. In practice, it was uneven, incomplete, and thinly manned. Germany lacked the troops to defend every kilometer with equal strength. The strategy relied on prediction, guessing where the Allies would land and reacting quickly once they did. Reaction, however, required mobility, and mobility required fuel, air cover, and flexible command. All were in short supply. German armored divisions were held back as a mobile reserve, but their release depended on authorization from the highest level. Field commanders could not commit them without approval. Hours mattered. Sometimes minutes. The system guaranteed delay at the very moment speed was essential. In the east, an even greater danger gathered. The Red Army had not paused after previous victories. Instead, it reorganized, expanded, and prepared a summer offensive of unprecedented scale. German intelligence detected activity, but underestimated its concentration and coordination. Defensive lines were extended, not deepened. Units were spread thin across broad fronts, tasked with holding territory rather than preserving combat power. Manpower shortages were now critical. Divisions on both fronts operated far below authorized strength. Heavy weapons existed without crews. Infantry companies were reduced to platoon size. Veterans fought beside men who had never experienced sustained combat. Air superiority was decisively lost. Allied aircraft dominated skies in the west. Soviet air forces controlled them in the east. German movement by day became nearly impossible. Supplies moved at night, slowly, and at great risk. The battlefield belonged to the attacker. Inside headquarters, confidence was maintained outwardly. Orders emphasized resolve. No withdrawals, no concessions. The belief persisted that one successful defense, one decisive counterattack could stabilize the situation. But the conditions that had once enabled such recoveries no longer existed. The German army of 1944 was strong enough to resist briefly, but too brittle to absorb shock. And when that shock came almost simultaneously from east and west, the structure that held the army together would begin to break. June 6, 1944. Before dawn, the western horizon ignited. Naval guns thundered. Aircraft filled the sky. Allied forces landed along the Normandy coast. In an operation of scale and coordination the German army could not counter in time. Defenses held in places. Units fought hard, but the system failed where it mattered. Most armored reserves remained immobilized by delayed authorization. Communications were disrupted. German units reacted locally, but without operational unity. By the time counterattacks were launched, Allied air power shattered movement and momentum. The beachhead held. Then it expanded as fighting intensified in Normandy. Germany's eastern front collapsed into catastrophe. On June 22, 1944, the Red Army launched Operation Begriff. It was not a single breakthrough, it was annihilation through coordination. Entire German army groups were encircled and destroyed. Defensive lines disintegrated within days. Losses reached levels unseen since the opening months of the war. German command could not shift forces west or east fast enough. There were no reserves left to move. What remained were fragments, isolated divisions, fighting independently, without strategic direction. The simultaneity of these offensives mattered. Either front alone would have strained Germany's capacity. Together, they broke it. The army could no longer trade space for time because time no longer existed. Every retreat revealed another weakness. Every stand cost irreplaceable men. In France, German units withdrew under constant attack, losing cohesion. In Tiesk, entire formations ceased to exist. The idea of restoring a stable front vanished. From this point forward, Germany would fight not to win but to delay defeat. The German army had not simply lost battles in 1944. It had lost its ability to function as a coordinated force. What followed was not recovery, but consequence measured in territory lost, armies destroyed, and decisions made in desperation. The consequences of 1944 unfolded with brutal clarity. Within weeks of the summer offensives, the German army had lost what it could never replace: entire formations, strategic depth, and the illusion of control. In the east, the destruction was catastrophic. Operation Begriff shattered the backbone of German forces. Army Group Center, once a pillar of the Eastern Front's east, to function as an organized force. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment losses were staggering. Artillery parks vanished. Tank units were erased. Defensive lines that had taken years to construct collapsed in days. Territory fell at a speed unseen since 1941. But now, in reverse. Belarus was lost. German forces were driven toward the borders of the Reich itself. Each retreat shortened supply lines for the Red Army and lengthened them for Germany, compounding the imbalance. In the West, the situation deteriorated differently but no less decisively. After Normandy, German units fought delaying actions through hedgerows and towns. But Allied material superiority dominated every engagement. Air power crushed movement. Artillery overwhelmed fixed positions. Withdrawals became chaotic as roads clogged with civilians, wounded, and remnants of shattered units. The German army still resisted, but it no longer controlled the tempo. Battles were fought on Allied terms. Every stand delayed the inevitable by days, sometimes hours, at the cost of men Germany could not replace. Casualty figures told the story plainly. By late 1944, German losses reached levels that exceeded training and replacement capacity. New formations were assembled from fragments, companies merged, battalions dissolved, divisions renamed to mask their weakness. Maps showed units that existed only administratively. At higher command levels, coherence collapsed alongside the fronts. Headquarters were overrun or forced to withdraw repeatedly. Communication networks disintegrated. Orders arrived too late. Too matter-or demanded actions that could not be executed. What emerged was an army fighting in pieces. Courage remained, discipline remained, but structure did not. The German army of late 1944 was no longer a force capable of shaping outcomes. It was reacting, retreating, and enduring under relentless pressure. And as the military situation worsened, decisions taken in Berlin would reflect a deeper shift from strategy to desperation, reshaping the final phase of the war. As 1944 progressed, the German response to defeat shifted from military adjustment to national desperation. With no reserves left to maneuver and no industry capable of restoring balance, the leadership turned inward, drawing strength, not from strategy, but from ideology and coercion. The creation of the Volkssturm symbolized this transformation. Older men, teenagers, and those previously deemed unfit were mobilized to defend cities and villages. They received minimal training, outdated weapons, and unrealistic expectations. This was not a force designed to win battles. It was a signal that the professional army had been exhausted. Inside, the regular Wehrmacht standards eroded under pressure. Units were ordered to hold ground regardless of cost. Commanders were instructed to enforce discipline through fear. Desertion was punished harshly, not because it could be stopped, but because it revealed how far morale had fallen. The Army's remaining operational capacity was spent on temporary stabilizations. Counteroffensives were planned with insufficient fuel and manpower. Tactical successes occurred, but they could not be exploited. Every gain was followed by heavier losses. Every pause favored the enemy. By late 1944, Germany no longer possessed strategic choice. The fronts had converged. The Reich itself became the battlefield. Cities turned into fortresses. Civilians were drawn into combat zones. The line between soldier and population blurred under bombardment and collapse. Most critically, the Army's psychological cohesion fractured. Officers and men alike understood that the war could not be won. What remained was duty, fear, and the hope of survival. The belief that once unified the German army, confidence in leadership, superiority, and purpose was gone. From this point forward, Germany would fight not for victory, but for time. Time to delay occupation. Time to protect families. Time to negotiate an ending that no longer existed. The fall of the German army in 1944 was not marked by a single surrender or declaration. It was marked by the absence of alternatives, and in that absence, history found its meaning. The collapse of the German army in 1944 was not the result of a single mistake, nor a sudden failure of courage. It was the consequence of limits strategic, material, and human finally reached. For years, Germany had relied on speed, initiative, and belief. When those advantages faded, They were replaced not with adaptation, but with rigidity. Orders became substitutes for strategy. Resolve replaced realism. The army was asked to endure conditions no force could survive indefinitely. What makes 1944 decisive is not only the scale of defeat, but its clarity. From Normandy to the Eastern Front, the war revealed an unbalanced equation. Industrial power against exhaustion, flexibility against command paralysis, replacement against depletion. No amount of discipline could offset that disparity. The soldiers who fought through that year were not defeated by a lack of skill. Many fought with professionalism until the end. They were defeated by a system that demanded sacrifice without offering solutions, by leadership that refused to adjust when adjustment was the only path left. In T-Sensei 1944 reshaped modern warfare. It demonstrated that wars are not won by brilliance alone, nor by ideology hardened into doctrine. They are won by systems logistics, command structures, adaptability, and the capacity to learn faster than the enemy. For humanity, the year stands as a warning. Military collapse does not always arrive with chaos and surrender. Sometimes it comes quietly through shortages, delayed orders, exhausted men, and decisions made too far from the front. By the time the German army fell apart, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. What remained was consequence. Cities in ruins, generations lost, a continent forever changed, and in the frozen roads, burned rail yards, and silent headquarters of 1944, history left a final lesson. No army collapses all at once, but every army reaches a moment when it can no longer hold itself together. That moment, for Germany, came in 1944.